In the heart of San Francisco, where the fog rolls in like a silent movie ghost and the clanging of cable cars is the city's heartbeat, some restaurants are more than just places to eat. They are institutions, hallowed halls of gastronomy, where fortunes are spent and reputations are made or broken. At the pinnacle of this world sits the Azure Point, a restaurant so exclusive it doesn't have a sign, only a discreet, polished brass seahorse on a heavy oak door. Inside, the air hums with the low thrum of power, the clinking of baccarat crystal, and the murmur of secrets being traded over plates of Michelin-starred art. For Clara Mae Thompson, a woman whose life had recently been downsized from a promising career as a historical archivist to the starched confines of a waitress's uniform, the air at the Azure Point tasted of gilded desperation. 3 months ago, she'd been surrounded by the comforting scent of old paper and leather-bound books, meticulously cataloging the personal correspondence of a Gilded Age railroad tycoon for the city's historical society. Then a restructuring and a budget cut had sent her and her passion for the past out onto the unforgiving streets of the present. Now she was learning a new set of rules, a dizzying choreography of service where a water glass was filled to precisely 1 inch from the rim, and a misplaced fork was a cardinal sin. The most important rule, however, wasn't in the employee handbook. It was delivered in a hushed, almost reverent tone by an old-timer bartender named Arthur, a man whose weary eyes had seen it all. "See that table?" he'd said on her first day, nodding toward a secluded corner booth with a panoramic view of the bay. "That's the Lion's Den, and the lioness comes every Thursday." The lioness was Victoria Sterling, the only daughter of real estate billionaire Alistair Sterling, a man who had chiseled his empire out of the city's very bedrock. Victoria, however, was a different breed of royalty. She was a socialite, a philanthropist, a permanent fixture in the society columns, but to the staff of the Azure Point, she was a quiet storm of terror. Her cruelty was a precise, surgical instrument, wielded with a chilling smile and an icy gaze. Clara had heard the stories. A young busboy, barely out of high school, fired on the spot because his shadow had fallen across her plate. A sommelier, a man with decades of experience, reduced to a trembling wreck because she'd declared his carefully chosen vintage pedestrian. Victoria Sterling didn't just dine at the Azure Point, she held court, and her subjects were the staff, who moved around her with the cautious grace of bomb disposal experts. This is not a story about a simple clash of wills. It's about the slow, deliberate unraveling of a carefully constructed facade. The discovery that even the most formidable fortresses are built on foundations of sand. It's a story of how a quiet woman with a reverence for the past used the truth as a weapon against a woman who had tried to bury hers forever. And it all began with a single, perfectly chilled glass of water. A week into her new life, Clara found herself in the Lion's Den. The regular server for Victoria's table had come down with a sudden and suspiciously convenient case of the flu. The manager, a perpetually flustered man named Mr. Dubois, had looked at Clara with the desperation of a man choosing a sacrifice. "Thompson," he'd said, his voice tight, "you're calm, you're precise, you're on table 7 tonight." Clara spent the next hour preparing for the encounter like a scholar preparing for a dissertation defense. She memorized Victoria's preferences. Still water, imported from a specific Norwegian spring, chilled to exactly 42 degrees Fahrenheit, with a single paper-thin slice of cucumber, not lemon. The bread basket was to contain only brioche, warmed for precisely 20 seconds. Every detail was a potential landmine. When Victoria Sterling arrived, a hush fell over the dining room. She was a vision of cold, calculated perfection, her raven hair swept into an elegant chignon, a dress the color of a stormy sea clinging to her slender frame. Her eyes, a startling shade of violet, scanned the room with an air of bored possession. She didn't so much walk to her table as glide, a swan moving through a world of lesser creatures. Clara approached the table, her heart a steady, determined drum against her ribs. "Good evening, Miss Sterling. My name is Clara Mae, and I will be your server tonight." Victoria's eyes flickered over her, a dismissive appraisal that lasted no more than a second. She didn't respond, simply gestured to her empty water glass. Clara, prepared for this, poured the chilled Norwegian water with a steady hand. She was about to place the cucumber slice in the glass when Victoria's voice, soft as silk but sharp as a razor, cut through the air. "Stop!" Clara froze, the silver tongs holding the cucumber slice, hovering over the glass. "What do you think you're doing?" Victoria asked, her voice dangerously calm. "I was just adding the cucumber, Mrs. Sterling." "Did I ask for cucumber?" Clara was certain she had. It was in the file, a preference noted in bold red ink. "My apologies, Miss Sterling. The file indicates—" "I don't care what the file indicates," Victoria interrupted, her eyes narrowing. "I am telling you right now that I do not want a vegetable in my water. Is that so difficult to comprehend?" The neighboring tables fell silent, their occupants sensing the beginning of one of Victoria's infamous public dissections. Mr. Dubois began to drift over, his face a mask of pained apology. But Clara didn't panic. She didn't grovel. Her years as an archivist had taught her to be meticulous, to trust her research. She looked at Victoria, not with fear, but with a quiet, analytical curiosity. Victoria wasn't just being difficult. She was testing her, setting a trap. "Of course, Miss Sterling," Clara said, her voice a perfect blend of professional deference and unshakable calm. "My apologies for the misunderstanding. I will bring you a fresh glass immediately." She removed the glass and returned moments later with a new one, filled with the same chilled water. Sans cucumber. Victoria watched her every move, a flicker of irritation in her violet eyes. She had expected a flustered, apologetic waitress. She had not expected this quiet, unflappable composure. It was like striking a match against a stone wall. There was no spark, no satisfying flare of fear. The rest of the meal was a tense, silent ballet. Victoria communicated in clipped gestures and monosyllabic commands, but Clara moved with a practiced, almost serene efficiency. She anticipated every need, her service a silent, flawless performance. She was not just a waitress. She was a student of history, and she was observing a historical artifact in its natural habitat, a predator whose power was derived not from strength, but from the fear of others. And Clara, much to her own surprise, wasn't afraid. She was fascinated. As Victoria was leaving, she paused beside Clara. "You're new here," she said, her voice a low purr. "Yes, Miss Sterling. Don't get comfortable." The words were a clear, unambiguous threat. But as Clara watched the real estate billionaire's daughter sweep out of the restaurant, she felt not a chill of fear, but the spark of an old, familiar instinct. The archivist in her, the woman who loved to dig through the dusty, forgotten corners of the past, had just been presented with a new and very compelling puzzle. Victoria Sterling had a carefully curated present, but Clara had a feeling that her past was a different story altogether. A story that was just waiting to be unearthed. The encounter with Victoria Sterling lit a fire in Clara. It wasn't about revenge. It was about understanding the anatomy of a bully. Her former mentor at the Historical Society used to say, "The more perfect the facade, the more fractured the foundation." Clara decided it was time to do some digging. Her investigation began not in the digital world, but in the whispered archives of the Azure Point. The restaurant's staff was a living library of Victoria's reign of terror. In the cramped break room, over lukewarm coffee and day-old pastries, Clara listened. "Remember the time she sent back a bottle of wine because she claimed the cork had an arrogant squeak?" a veteran waiter recalled. "Or when she insisted the chef remake her risotto because the grains were not aligned in a soothing manner?" another added. These were tales of petty tyranny, but Clara was looking for a pattern. The common thread was Victoria's obsession with a very specific, almost theatrical performance of old money elegance. Any deviation from her script was met with a disproportionate, almost frantic rage. It suggested not the confidence of a woman born to wealth, but the anxiety of an imposter terrified of being exposed. Arthur, the bartender, became her most valuable source. One rainy Tuesday night, as the restaurant hummed with a quiet, subdued energy, Clara leaned against the bar. "You've been here a long time, Arthur. What was she like when she first started coming in?" Arthur paused, polishing a glass until it gleamed. "Different. Trying to be the same, but the seams were showing. This was about 15 years ago, right after her father, Alistair, made his first billion. She was eager, too eager, watching everyone, what they wore, how they held their forks. She was learning a role. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping. The really strange thing is, before Alistair Sterling became a household name in this city, there was no Victoria Sterling. Not in the society pages, not anywhere. Clara's archival instincts tingled. What do you mean? I mean, the day Alistair Sterling hit the Forbes list, Victoria appeared on his arm, a fully formed socialite with a vague backstory about a Swiss boarding school and a quiet upbringing. I've served all the old money families in this city for 30 years. I'd never heard of her. A woman with no past. That wasn't just a crack in the facade. It was a missing cornerstone. That night, Clara went home to her small, book-filled apartment. She fired up her laptop, her fingers flying across the keyboard with a familiar, practiced rhythm. She started with the basics. Public records. A search for Victoria Sterling with an estimated birth year yielded predictable results. Charity events, fashion shows, glowing profiles in luxury magazines. It was a digital smokescreen, a carefully constructed narrative. So she changed her tactics. She began searching for Alistair Sterling, focusing on news archives from before his rise to prominence. He was a ruthless, ambitious developer, but his early years were shrouded in a surprising amount of obscurity. He had appeared on the San Francisco scene seemingly out of nowhere, a man with a Midas touch and a mysterious past. Clara started digging into old property records, business filings, anything that could shed light on Alistair's origins. For days, she hit nothing but dead ends. And then she found it, tucked away in the digital archives of a small local newspaper from a dusty, forgotten town in the Nevada desert, was a brief article from the late 1980s about a contentious zoning dispute. A small, family-owned diner was being forced out to make way for a new development project. The developer's name was Alistair Sterling. The article was unremarkable, except for one small detail. It mentioned Alistair's family, his wife, who had passed away years earlier, and his young daughter. The daughter's name was not Victoria, it was Chastity. Chastity Sterling. Clara felt a jolt of adrenaline, the familiar thrill of an archivist on the verge of a breakthrough. She ran a new search, this time for Chastity Sterling, and the results, though sparse, began to paint a very different picture. A few mentions in the local Nevada paper, a high school honor roll, a win at a county fair pie-eating contest, and then the digital Rosetta Stone. It was a link to a grainy, low-quality video on a forgotten video-sharing platform. The video was from a local access cable channel in Nevada, a broadcast of a small-town beauty pageant from the early 1990s. The pageant's theme was Silver State Sweethearts. Clara's hands trembled as she clicked play. And there she was, a much younger, much less polished version of Victoria Sterling. Her hair was a brassy, over-teased blonde, not the sophisticated raven black. She wore a cheap sequin dress and a forced, desperate smile. But the bone structure was the same, the sharp jawline, the high cheekbones, and the eyes, not violet, but a pale, hard blue filled with a fierce, almost desperate ambition. The announcer's voice, tinny and distorted, boomed through the laptop speakers. And now, giving us her rendition of God Bless America, is contestant number 7, the lovely Chastity Sterling. The girl on the screen opened her mouth and a reedy, off-key voice filled the air. But it wasn't the singing that made Clara's breath catch. It was the interview portion that followed. "So, Chastity," the host said, "what do you want to be when you grow up?" The young woman's face hardened, her smile tightening. "I'm going to be rich," she said, her voice a flat, hard drawl, a world away from the clipped, vaguely European accent Victoria used now. "Richer than all of you. And I'm going to get out of this town, and I am never ever coming back." Clara leaned back in her chair, a slow smile spreading across her face. The lioness of the Azure Point, the queen of San Francisco society, had a skeleton in her closet. And that skeleton was a small-town beauty queen named Chastity, with a bad singing voice and a heart full of rage. The carefully constructed world of Victoria Sterling was a lie, a multi-million-dollar effort to bury the ghost of Chastity. The whispers in the restaurant were nothing. Clara had just found the name. the name that Victoria Sterling had tried to bury forever. The discovery of Chastity Sterling changed everything for Clara, but she knew that knowledge was a weapon that had to be wielded with precision. A direct confrontation would be a fool's errand. For now, she held the secret close, a hidden ace in the starched pocket of her uniform. Her continued composure, however, was having an unnerving effect on Victoria. Clara's refusal to be baited was a constant, low-grade irritant, a grain of sand in the perfectly oiled machine of her dominance. If she couldn't break the new waitress with psychological warfare, she would have to escalate. She would have to destroy her. The attack came on a balmy Saturday evening, when the azure point was at its glittering, chaotic peak. Victoria was at her usual table, holding court for a group of equally wealthy and influential friends. She was the picture of charm and grace, but Clara, now attuned to the subtle tells, could see the tension in her jaw, the way her violet eyes kept flicking towards her. She was a panther in the tall grass, waiting for the perfect moment to pounce. The moment came after the main course plates had been cleared. Victoria let out a small, perfectly timed gasp, bringing a hand to her throat, her diamond-encrusted fingers fluttering against her skin. "Oh my goodness," she said, her voice a carefully calibrated mix of shock and panic. "It's gone." Her friends turned to her, their faces etched with concern. "What's gone, darling?" One of them, a woman named Beatrice, asked. "My necklace," Victoria exclaimed, her voice rising just enough to cut through the dining room's ambient hum. "The sterling sapphire. My father gave it to me for my 30th birthday. It's gone." A wave of hushed whispers spread from their table. The sterling sapphire was a legendary piece of jewelry, a massive cornflower blue gem, rumored to be worth more than a fleet of luxury cars. Victoria stood up, her face a mask of frantic disbelief. "It was here just a moment ago. I remember fidgeting with it right before the waitress cleared my plate." Her eyes, cold and sharp as shards of ice, locked onto Clara. "You, the waitress. You were the last one at this table. You leaned over me when you took my friend's plate." The accusation, as devastating as it was predictable, hung in the air. Clara felt a cold dread wash over her, but her archival training, the discipline of staying calm and methodical in the face of chaos, took over. "Stay calm. Observe. Do not react." "Mrs. Sterling," Clara said, her voice steady despite the frantic pounding in her chest, "I assure you, I didn't see a necklace." "Of course you would say that," Beatrice chimed in, eager to play her part in the drama. "It could have fallen onto the plate, and you just whisked it away with the scraps." Mr. Dubois rushed over, his face pale and slick with sweat. "Miss Sterling, what seems to be the trouble?" "The trouble, Dubois," Victoria said, pointing a trembling, accusatory finger at Clara, "is that my necklace, a piece of jewelry worth a small fortune, has vanished, and your waitress here was the last person near me. I want her searched. I want the kitchen searched. I want that necklace found." This was the checkmate, a public branding. In this rarefied world, the word of Victoria Sterling against that of a waitress was an open and shut case. Clara would be fired, her reputation shattered. The accusation of theft, even if unproven, would be a permanent stain, a professional death sentence. Mr. Dubois looked at Clara, his eyes a mixture of pity and pleading. "Clara May, did you see anything at all?" "No, sir," Clara said firmly. "I cleared the plates and took them directly to the kitchen." "Search her pockets," Beatrice demanded. "That won't be necessary," Clara said, her voice cutting through the rising tide of hysteria. She looked Mr. Dubois in the eye. "I will happily empty my pockets. I have nothing to hide." She calmly took out her server's notepad, a pen, and a tube of hand lotion, placing them on a nearby service stand for all to see. Victoria scoffed. "As if you'd keep it in your pocket. It's probably in the kitchen, stashed in a bin, waiting for you to retrieve it at the end of your shift." The trap was as brilliant as it was cruel. The necklace was most likely nestled safely in the silk lining of Victoria's own clutch, waiting to be discovered later, after Clara's life had been thoroughly and irrevocably ruined. An accusation was all that was needed. "We will, of course, search the kitchen," Mr. Dubois stammered, trying to placate her. "And what about her?" Victoria insisted, her voice rising to a shrill, theatrical pitch. "She should be detained. We should call the police." The staff began a frantic, humiliating search, on their hands and knees peering under tables. Clara stood still, the silent, accused eye of the hurricane. She knew she was being framed. She knew that denials were futile. She had to change the narrative. She had to use the one weapon Victoria didn't know she possessed: knowledge. This was the moment, not to drop a bomb, but to plant a seed of doubt, to introduce an element of chaos into Victoria's perfectly staged drama. As the fruitless search continued, a suffocating sense of doom settled over Clara. Mr. Dubois was wringing his hands. Victoria was looking triumphant. "We can't find anything, Mrs. Sterling," Mr. Dubois reported, his voice shaky. "Then call the police," Victoria commanded. "I want to file a report." The word report hung in the air, a final damning verdict. Clara knew this was her last chance. She couldn't prove her innocence regarding the necklace, because the necklace's location was part of the lie. But she could attack the credibility of her accuser. She took a deep breath and looked directly at Victoria. Her voice was not loud, but it was clear, and it carried an unusual weight. "Ms. Sterling, perhaps you should check your clutch again. Sometimes, when things are stressful, we misplace things." Victoria laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Are you suggesting I'm being forgetful?" "I think not." "Not at all," Clara said, her tone still perfectly even. "It's just that high-stress situations can be disorienting. They can make you feel like you're in a different time, a different place." She paused for a beat, letting the words hang in the air. "A place with a lot of dust and silver state pageants, for instance." The words dropped into the charged atmosphere of the restaurant with the force of a physical blow. They were so specific, so utterly out of place that they created a moment of pure, unadulterated confusion. Victoria's friends looked puzzled. Mr. Dubois frowned. "But Victoria?" Victoria froze. For a fraction of a second, the mask of the elegant, wronged socialite slipped. A flicker of raw, primal fear flashed in her eyes. It was the look of a cornered animal. Her face, which had been flushed with righteous anger, turned a deathly pale. "What? What did you say?" she stammered, her voice losing its imperious edge. Clara held her gaze, her expression a perfect blank. "I said things can be disorienting," she repeated softly. "My apologies if I misspoke." But the damage was done. The surgical strike had hit its mark. Clara hadn't accused her of anything. She had simply painted a tiny, vivid picture, a picture that meant nothing to anyone else in the room, but meant everything to Victoria. It was a signal, a quiet, devastating whisper. "I know." The shift in Victoria's demeanor was palpable. Her confidence wavered. The righteous fury that had been her shield now seemed brittle. She had lost control of the narrative. Sensing his friend's sudden distress, one of the men at the table stood up. "All right, this has gone on long enough. Victoria, let's just go. We'll deal with the insurance company for the necklace." "No," Victoria said, but her voice lacked its earlier conviction. She was rattled, her mind clearly racing to understand how this waitress, this nobody, could possibly know. It was then that Clara played her final card. It was a gamble, a piece of psychological theater based on a hunch about human nature and the vanity of a woman like Victoria. "Ms. Sterling," Clara said, her voice still calm and reasonable, "before you go, perhaps you could check the small silk pocket on the inside of your wrap. Sometimes a clasp can come undone, and a heavy pendant can slip into an unexpected place." Victoria shot Clara a look of pure venom. She knew what was happening. Clara was offering her an out, an escape route, but an escape route that would make her look utterly, laughably foolish. It was a checkmate. If the necklace was found on her person, the entire elaborate scene she had created would collapse into a ridiculous, hysterical farce. Hesitantly, Beatrice, her friend, reached for Victoria's cashmere wrap, which was draped over the back of her chair. "Well, it's worth a look, I suppose," she said, her voice uncertain. Beatrice's fingers fumbled with the wrap, and then her expression shifted from confusion to surprise. Her fingers closed around a small, hard object. She pulled it out. There, glittering under the soft, expensive lighting of the azure point, was the sterling sapphire. its deep blue catching the light like a captured piece of the twilight sky. A collective gasp went through the room. "Well, I'll be," Beatrice muttered, staring at the necklace. "It must have come unclasped and fallen right into your wrap." She looked at her friend, a hint of annoyance now coloring her tone. "All this fuss, Victoria, and it was here the whole time." The humiliation was instantaneous and complete. Victoria's face went from pale to a deep mottled red. She had accused a waitress of grand theft, demanded a police investigation, and held the entire restaurant hostage, only for the missing item to be found in her own wrap. She didn't look like a powerful victim. She looked like a fool, a hysterical, paranoid, wealthy woman who had misplaced her necklace and thrown a childish tantrum. Her friends suddenly found the patterns on their plates intensely fascinating. The whispers around the room were no longer of theft, but of ridicule. Without another word, Victoria snatched the necklace from Beatrice's hand, grabbed her clutch, and stormed out of the restaurant, her head held high, but her entire posture screaming defeat. Her friends were left to settle the bill, their faces a mask of weary apology, leaving a crater of social embarrassment in their wake. Mr. Dubois looked at Clara, his expression a mixture of awe and terror. He didn't understand what had just happened, not really, but he knew that Clara had somehow faced down the lioness in her own den and, against all odds, won. Clara took a steadying breath, her adrenaline slowly beginning to recede. She hadn't exposed Chastity Sterling. She hadn't needed to. She had simply used a few carefully chosen words to unravel the thread of Victoria's composure, making her look not just cruel, but utterly, laughably ridiculous. And in Victoria Sterling's world, being ridiculous was a fate far worse than being feared. The fallout from the necklace incident was immediate and profound. Overnight, the atmosphere at the Azure Point shifted. The staff no longer looked at Clara with pity, but with a kind of bewildered reverence. She was the woman who had made the Queen look like a court jester. The fear of Victoria Sterling hadn't vanished, but it was now laced with a delicious, liberating element of mockery. Victoria, predictably, did not return the following Thursday, or the Thursday after that. Her absence was a palpable relief, the lifting of a long, oppressive siege. But Clara knew it wasn't over. A woman like Victoria Sterling didn't just accept humiliation. She would be plotting her revenge, something more permanent and destructive than a public tantrum. Clara knew she had to arm herself for the final confrontation. It was time to fully resurrect the ghost of Chastity Sterling. Her first step was to find a primary source, someone who knew Chastity before she had buried herself under layers of sterling wealth and a new identity. The small-town Nevada newspaper archives were a start, but they were a cold, impersonal record. Clara needed a human connection. She found a promising lead in a high school yearbook she'd managed to access through an online genealogy database. Under Chastity Sterling's senior picture, there was a list of extracurricular activities, including the Future Homemakers of America Club. The club's faculty advisor was a woman named Eleanor Vance. A quick search revealed that Eleanor Vance, now in her late 60s, was still living in the same small Nevada town, retired after a 40-year career as a home economics teacher. It was a long shot, but Clara composed a carefully worded email introducing herself as a freelance writer working on a story about the changing face of the American West and how the lives of young women in small towns had evolved over the past few decades. She mentioned that she'd come across Chastity Sterling's name in her research and would love to hear any memories Mrs. Vance might have of a former student. For 2 days, there was no reply. Clara started to think it was a dead end. Then, an email notification popped up. It was from Eleanor Vance. "Dear Ms. Thompson," the email began, "I remember Chastity Sterling very well. A very driven young woman. If you're ever in our neck of the woods, I'd be happy to chat over a cup of tea." 2 days later, Clara was driving her beat-up sedan through the vast, empty expanse of the Nevada desert, the shimmering heat a world away from the cool, foggy streets of San Francisco. She found Eleanor Vance in a small, tidy house with a garden full of resilient desert roses. Over iced tea and homemade shortbread cookies, Eleanor painted a vivid and often poignant picture of the girl who would become Victoria Sterling. "Chastity was a girl in a hurry," Eleanor said, her voice tinged with a sad, gentle wisdom. Her mother had passed away when she was young, and her father, Alistair, was always working, always scheming. He was a hard man, obsessed with making money, with escaping his own humble beginnings, and he poured all of that ambition, all of that shame into his daughter. She described a young girl who was relentlessly drilled on etiquette, who was forced to take voice and deportment lessons, who was constantly told that her small-town roots were something to be ashamed of, something to be erased. She was fiercely ambitious, yes, Eleanor continued, but she was also deeply, deeply insecure. She believed that the only way to be loved, the only way to be safe, was to be perfect, to be powerful, to be someone else entirely. The beauty pageants, the desperate attempts at sophistication, it was all part of Alistair's grand plan to mold his daughter into a suitable heiress for the empire he was determined to build. "Is there anything else?" Clara asked, sensing there was more to the story. "Any specific event she'd be terrified of people knowing?" Eleanor was quiet for a moment, her gaze distant. "There is one thing," she said slowly. "Her senior year, there was a scandal. A boy in her class, a sweet kid from a poor family, had a crush on her. He wrote her a poem. It was clumsy, heartfelt, but to Chastity, it was a reminder of the commonness she was so desperate to escape. She didn't just reject him, she humiliated him, read the poem aloud in the crowded school hallway, mocking every word. The boy was devastated. He dropped out of school a week later." Eleanor sighed, a deep, weary sound. "But that's not the worst of it. The boy's family owned a small plot of land, nothing special, but it stood in the way of a development project Alistair wanted. A month after the incident with the poem, there was a fire. The family's barn burned down. The official cause was faulty wiring, but there were rumors, ugly rumors. The family, broken and defeated, sold their land to Alistair for a fraction of its worth and left town. Nothing was ever proven, of course," Eleanor said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "But Chastity, she knew. I saw it in her eyes. She knew her cruelty had paved the way for her father's greed. It was the first and perhaps the last time I ever saw a flicker of genuine fear in that girl's eyes. A fire, a ruined family, a secret buried under years of wealth and a new name. This was more than just a skeleton in the closet. This was a ghost that had the power to burn Victoria Sterling's carefully constructed world to the ground." Clara thanked Eleanor, her mind racing. She now understood the core of Victoria's being. Her cruelty wasn't just about power. It was a desperate, ongoing effort to outrun the ghost of her past, to silence the whisper of shame that had been her constant companion since that fateful day in a high school hallway. Clara knew Victoria would be back. Her ego, her pride, would demand that she return to the scene of her humiliation to reassert her dominance. She would come back to destroy the waitress who had seen behind the curtain. But when she did, Clara would be ready. She wouldn't be fighting Victoria Sterling, the billionaire's daughter. She would be waiting for Chastity Sterling, the girl with a terrible burning secret, and Clara was holding the match. 3 weeks after the necklace incident, Victoria Sterling returned to the Azure Point. It was a Thursday night, and a wave of palpable tension rolled through the dining room as she swept in. This time she was alone. She was dressed not in her usual elegant evening wear, but in a sharp, severe black pantsuit, as if for battle. She didn't wait to be seated. She walked directly to her usual table, her eyes scanning the room until they found Clara. She crooked a single finger, a silent, imperious summons. Mr. Dubois rushed forward, intending to intervene, but Clara gave him a subtle shake of her head. This was inevitable. This was the final act. She smoothed her apron and walked toward the table, her heart beating a steady, determined rhythm. "Good evening, Miss Sterling," Clara said, her voice neutral. Victoria didn't return the greeting. She gestured to the chair opposite her. "Sit." It was a flagrant breach of protocol, a deliberate power move. "I'm on duty, Mr. Sterling." "Sit," she repeated, her voice low and menacing, "or I will buy this restaurant by morning and have it torn down. Your choice." Clara pulled out the chair and sat, her back perfectly straight. The other diners watched, mystified by the bizarre scene unfolding. "I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing," Victoria began, leaning forward, her violet eyes burning with a cold fire. I don't know how you found out. What you think you know? I assume you dug up some dirt, and you're planning some pathetic, clumsy blackmail attempt. It was a mistake. I don't know what you're talking about, Clara said calmly. Don't you lie to me, Victoria hissed, her composure cracking. You think you're clever. You think you embarrassed me. Let me tell you what's going to happen now. I have had my father's legal team run a complete background check on you, Clara Mae Thompson. I know all about your failed career as a dust-sifting archivist. I know about your student loans. I know about the tiny, pathetic apartment you can barely afford. You are a nobody. She leaned back, a cruel smirk on her lips. By the time I am finished with you, you won't even be able to get a job washing dishes. I will personally call every potential employer. I will tell them you are a thief, a blackmailer, an unstable, vindictive little insect. I will sue you for slander. I will bury you in legal fees until you are begging for mercy. I will destroy every corner of your miserable life. Do you understand me? Clara listened to the litany of threats without flinching. This was the dragon's fire, the final, desperate attempt to incinerate the threat. But Clara wasn't afraid of the fire anymore, because she knew what the dragon was made of. She leaned forward slightly, matching Victoria's posture. You're right about one thing, Clara said, her voice soft, but carrying an unmistakable edge of steel. I am an archivist, and I am very, very good at my job. I know you're not Victoria Sterling from a Swiss boarding school. I know you're Chastity Sterling from a dusty town in Nevada. Victoria's face tightened, but she held her ground. Lies and slander. I know about the Silver State Sweethearts pageant, Clara continued, her voice dropping even lower. And I know about a boy who wrote you a poem, a boy whose family lost everything in a fire right after you humiliated him. At the mention of the fire, Victoria's composure finally completely shattered. The blood drained from her face, leaving her with a deathly pallor. This was a direct hit. This wasn't a vague reference to a pageant. This was the ghost, summoned from the depths of her past and seated right at the table with them. I know about the barn, Chastity, Clara said, the use of the old name a deliberate twist of the knife. I know about the rumors. I know about the family that was driven out of town so your father could build his empire on their ashes. Victoria stared at her, speechless. Her breath came in ragged gasps. She looked not like a powerful billionaire's daughter, but like the terrified girl from the past, her worst nightmare come to life. Here is what's going to happen now, Clara said, taking complete control. You are going to leave this restaurant. You are never going to come back. You are not going to harass, threaten, or even speak the name of any person on this staff ever again. You are going to leave me and everyone here alone. If you do not, if I hear so much as a whisper of you causing trouble for anyone, I will dedicate my life to uncovering the truth about that fire. I will find that family, and I will write their story, and I will make sure that every newspaper, every television station, every blog in this country knows that the Sterling Empire was built on a foundation of cruelty, greed, and a very convenient fire. Every word was a perfectly placed blow. Clara laid out the terms of surrender, not of a waitress to a patron, but of one woman who had the truth to another who was drowning in a lifetime of lies. For a long, silent moment, Victoria simply stared. The fear in her eyes slowly gave way to a look of utter, soul-deep hatred. But she was defeated. She was completely and utterly defeated. The ghost Clara had summoned was standing right behind her, and it had its cold, unforgiving hands on her shoulders. Slowly, shakily, Victoria Sterling, née Chastity Sterling, rose from the table. She didn't say a word. She didn't look at anyone. With the last tattered shred of her dignity, she turned and walked out of the Azure Point for the final time. The heavy oak doors swung shut behind her, and it was as if a curse had been lifted. A stunned silence filled the dining room, followed by a quiet, spontaneous burst of applause from the kitchen staff, who had been watching from the doorway. Mr. Dubois walked over to Clara, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and profound respect. I don't know what to say. Clara finally let out a long, shuddering breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She stood up and picked up the water pitcher from her service station. Don't worry, Mr. Dubois, she said. a small, genuine smile gracing her lips for the first time all night. Table 4 needs more water. She was no longer just Clara Mae Thompson, the waitress. She was the woman who had faced the lioness and sent her running from her own den, not with fire or fury, but with the quiet, undeniable power of the truth. And just like that, the reign of terror was over. The story of what happened that night at the Azure Point became a legend, whispered among the city's service industry. A tale of how a quiet waitress with a spine of steel and a historian's mind toppled a tyrant. Clara didn't stay a waitress for long. Her actions and the quiet dignity with which she carried them out caught the attention of a wealthy patron, a retired history professor who had witnessed the final confrontation. He admired her courage, her intellect, and her passion for the past. He offered her a job funding and running a new independent historical research foundation, allowing her to return to the work she truly loved, unearthing the forgotten stories of the city. Victoria Sterling was never seen in that part of the city again, a ghost in her own gilded cage, haunted by a name she could no longer bury. This story is a powerful reminder that true strength isn't about wealth or power, but about the courage to stand firm in the truth. It shows that bullies, no matter how formidable, are often just scared people, hiding behind a fragile mask. And sometimes all it takes is one quiet voice, armed with a forgotten fact, to bring the whole facade crumbling down. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more stories about unexpected heroes and the quiet triumph of justice.